I stood at the front door, with my arms aching under the weight of carefully chosen gifts, unaware that this single moment would expose the truth I had spent years refusing to see. The porch was quiet, the kind of quiet that should have felt peaceful, but instead carried a strange tension. I pressed the doorbell once, then waited, shifting the bags slightly to keep them from slipping. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last, until my anticipation began to dull into unease. When the door finally opened, it did not reveal warmth or gratitude, but irritation so sharp it felt like a slap. My sister stood there with swollen eyes and a face hardened by annoyance. Not surprise. There was no greeting, no smile, no acknowledgement of the effort I had made to show up with love wrapped in expensive paper. Her voice cut through the air, loud and accusatory, declaring that I had ruined her day by arriving unannounced. The words hit me before I could even process her expression. I tried to explain that I only wanted to surprise the children, that the gifts were meant to bring joy. But my intentions dissolved the moment her husband's voice drifted from inside the house. He didn't bother to appear. Didn't feel the need to look me in the eye. He dismissed me from the couch, as if I were an inconvenience, rather than the person who quietly carried their financial burdens. In that instant, the truth became painfully clear. The gifts in my hands were not symbols of love to them. They were expectations. They were obligations they felt entitled to receive, not gestures to be appreciated. The years I had spent sacrificing my own comfort, my own dreams, my own future, had taught them that my role was not to be respected, but to provide. Standing there, holding bags filled with things bought through overtime hours and quiet exhaustion, I realized that my presence itself was unwanted, unless it came with something they could use. I looked down at the boxes resting on the doormat, treated with the same indifference one might show discarded mail. For a moment, I considered leaving them behind, complying with the command to drop the gifts and go. But something inside me shifted. Leaving them, there would have been another silent agreement that this treatment was acceptable, that my effort had no value beyond its price tag. So instead, I bent down, gathered every item back into my arms, and turned away. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't beg for appreciation. My silence was the first boundary I had set in years. As I walked back to my car, the weight I carried felt different. It was no longer just the physical burden of the gifts, but the emotional weight of realization settling in. This moment on the porch was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a pattern I had enabled for far too long. Every time I paid a bill without being asked, every time I solved a crisis they created, every time I ignored my own resentment in the name of family, I had reinforced the belief that I existed to serve their needs. That door closing behind me echoed louder than any argument could have. It marked the end of an illusion I had clung to, the idea that generosity alone could sustain love and respect. What it revealed instead was entitlement grown comfortable in the shadow of my silence. The gift at the door did not fail to bring joy because it lacked value. It failed because it exposed a truth I could no longer ignore. Love without boundaries becomes permission for exploitation. And standing on that porch, turning away with my arms full and my heart finally awake, I took the first step toward reclaiming my dignity. Family love is supposed to feel like safety, like belonging, like a place where effort is seen and care flows both ways. For me, it slowly transformed into something unrecognizable, something transactional, until I could no longer deny what I had become. Somewhere along the way, love stopped being measured in time, presence, or emotional support, and was instead calculated in dollars spent, bills paid, and problems solved with my bank card. I didn't notice the shift at first because it happened gradually, disguised as responsibility and sacrifice. After our parents died, I stepped into a role I never consciously chose. I told myself I was protecting what remained of our family, that stepping up financially was an act of love. At first, it was necessities, keeping a roof over our heads, ensuring school fees were paid, making sure there was food in the house. Each payment felt justified, even noble. I worked longer hours, postpone my own ambitions, and convince myself that exhaustion was temporary. What I failed to see was how quickly help can turn into expectation when there are no limits. Over time, gratitude faded. Requests were no longer framed as favors, but as assumptions. If a bill needed paying, it was silently understood that I would handle it. If something went wrong, I was expected to fix it. My phone became a lifeline not for emotional connection, but for financial rescue. Calls came with urgency, not concern for my well-being, and messages carried demands rather than appreciation. I was no longer asked how I was doing, only whether I could cover the next expense. The most painful part was how normal this dynamic became. Family gatherings felt less like reunions and more like audits of what I could provide next. I watched as my hard-earned money funded comforts and luxuries I denied myself, all while being told I was lucky to have stability. Any hesitation on my part was met with guilt, reminding me of sacrifices I had already made, twisting my sense of duty into a weapon against me. Love was no longer mutual. It was conditional on access. I began to realize that my value in their eyes was directly tied to what I could pay for. My presence mattered only when it came with solutions, purchases, or financial relief. Emotional support flowed in one direction, outward from me, while I was expected to remain strong, silent, and endlessly capable. When I needed rest, understanding, or even simple acknowledgement, there was none to be found. The relationship had lost its humanity and adopted the cold efficiency of a transaction. What hurt most was recognizing how my own actions had contributed to this outcome. By always stepping in, I had unknowingly removed any incentive for accountability or growth. I had mistaken control for care and financial provision for love. In shielding them from consequences, I had placed myself directly in the path of exploitation. My generosity, once rooted in compassion, had been repurposed into entitlement by those who benefited from it most. The moment I finally confronted this truth, it felt like mourning a loss. Not just the loss of money, but the loss of the family bond I believed we shared. Accepting that I had become an ATM was devastating, but it was also clarifying. It forced me to understand that love without boundaries does not nurture relationships. It erodes them. Real family love should not drain one person to sustain everyone else. Coming to terms with this reality did not make me heartless or selfish. It made me honest. I learned that saying no was not a betrayal, but a reclaiming of my worth. Family love should never reduce someone to a resource. And recognizing when that line has been crossed is the first step toward choosing dignity over obligation. The moment I cut the financial cord did not arrive with drama or raised voices. It came quietly, almost deceptively calm, in the middle of an ordinary workday. I was sitting at my desk, surrounded by reports and deadlines, trying to focus on responsibilities I had earned through years of discipline. My phone vibrated again and again, each notification pulling me further away from the fragile peace I was attempting to maintain. When I finally looked, I saw alerts informing me that transactions were being declined on accounts I rarely used myself. Expensive purchases, indulgent expenses, and luxuries I would never justify were failing because I had reached my limit. In that instant, something inside me shifted. I logged into my banking account with a steady hand that betrayed the emotional storm rising in my chest. The screen displayed years of quiet generosity laid bare in numbers and dates. Charges stacked on top of charges, none of them mine, all of them enabled by my silence. I felt a deep, nauseating realization settle in as I scrolled through the list of authorized users, recognizing how casually my access had been treated. What I had once offered as support had been consumed without thought, without respect, without acknowledgement. The clarity was painful but undeniable. As my cursor hovered over the option to deactivate the cards, hesitation flickered briefly. Not fear of their reaction, but grief for the illusion I was about to destroy. Cutting the cord meant accepting that love alone could not fix what had been broken, and that sacrifice without limits had only delayed the inevitable. I thought of the years I had worked overtime, the personal dreams I had postponed, The exhaustion I carried quietly so no one else would feel discomfort. I realized that choosing myself was not an act of abandonment, but a refusal to continue disappearing. With one deliberate click, I ended the arrangement that had defined my role for over a decade. The screen refreshed, showing the status as inactive, and the silence that followed felt both terrifying and liberating. Almost immediately, my phone began to light up with incoming calls, messages filled with panic and outrage. I didn't answer. For the first time, I allowed their crisis to remain theirs. The urgency that once commanded my immediate response no longer held power over me. As the noise continued, I felt something unexpected settle in. Relief. It was subtle at first, like the easing of a constant pressure I hadn't realized I was carrying. I was no longer bracing for the next demand, the next emergency that would drain me further. I understood then that the financial cord had never been just about money. It was about control, dependency, and the unspoken expectation that I would always be there to fix what others refused to take responsibility for. Choosing myself meant accepting the discomfort of being misunderstood. I knew I would be labeled selfish, cruel, and ungrateful, but those judgments no longer outweighed the cost of continued self-erasure. For years, my identity had been tied to what I could provide, not who I was. Severing that connection allowed me to reclaim my autonomy, my time, and my sense of self-worth. In the quiet that followed, I returned my attention to my work, aware that the consequences of my decision were still unfolding. Yet for the first time in a long while, I felt grounded. I was no longer financing avoidance or shielding adults from their own choices. I had chosen clarity over guilt, boundaries over fear. Cutting the financial cord was not just a practical decision. It was a declaration. I was done sacrificing my future to sustain someone else's irresponsibility. In choosing myself, I finally stepped out of survival mode and into a life that belonged to me. The promise was made in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and quiet despair, a place where time seemed suspended between hope and grief. I sat beside my mother's bed, listening to the rhythmic beeping of machines that measured what little strength she had left. Her hand felt fragile in mine, yet her grip tightened when she spoke, as if transferring the weight of her fear directly into my bones. In a voice barely louder than a breath, she asked me to take care of my sister, to protect her from suffering when she was gone. I agreed without hesitation, believing that love meant saying yes no matter the cost. At that moment, I could not imagine how far that promise would reach into my future. I was young, unprepared, and desperate to give my mother peace in her final hours. When she passed, the words I had spoken became an unbreakable oath in my mind, guiding every decision I made. Grief did not allow space for reflection. I stepped into responsibility automatically, believing that carrying the burden alone was the most honorable way to honor her memory. Sacrifice became my routine. I let go of opportunities that once felt within reach, trading ambition for stability because leaving felt like betrayal. Each compromise was justified as temporary, a small price to pay for family. I worked longer hours, accepted exhaustion as normal, and learned to silence my own needs before they could even form into desires. The promise followed me everywhere, shaping my choices and defining my worth by how much I could endure. As the years passed, what began as care slowly turned into obligation. I told myself that providing was the same as protecting, that shielding my sister from hardship was proof I was keeping my word. I filled gaps with money, solved problems before they became lessons, and absorbed every consequence so she wouldn't have to. I believed this was love, never questioning whether love should require the complete erasure of oneself. The weight of that promise grew heavier with time. It settled into my shoulders and followed me into every sleepless night. I measured my success not by my own happiness, but by how little discomfort she experienced. When resentment surfaced, I buried it under guilt, reminding myself of that hospital room and my mother's pleading eyes. I convinced myself that feeling tired or unfulfilled was selfish when someone else depended on me. What I failed to see was how sacrifice, when left unchecked, distorts relationships. by removing struggle from my sister's life. I also removed accountability. I taught her that support would always arrive without effort. That responsibility could be deferred indefinitely. My promise, once rooted in love, became a system that enabled dependence rather than resilience. I had confused devotion with control, and generosity with necessity. Only with time did I begin to understand that a promise made in grief is not always meant to define an entire lifetime. Love should not demand permanent self-denial. Honoring my mother did not mean destroying myself in the process. True care would have involved guidance, boundaries, and the courage to let my sister face her own challenges. Instead, I carried everything alone, believing that suffering was the measure of loyalty. Looking back, I see how that hospital promise shaped me, but I also see how it imprisoned me. It turned compassion into obligation and love into sacrifice without end. Understanding this does not erase the sincerity of my intentions, but it allows me to forgive myself for finally letting go. A promise made in love should lead to growth, not depletion, and realizing that truth was the first step toward reclaiming a life that had been placed on hold for far too long. I walked back into the house believing I was returning to retrieve a few necessities. Nothing more than clothing and a familiar comfort for a sick child. I expected disorder, maybe neglect, but I was unprepared for the truth that waited behind the door. The air was heavy with the stench of decay, a suffocating mixture of old food, alcohol, and something deeper moral rot. Each step inside felt like crossing into a place where responsibility had long since been abandoned. What once appeared livable under the illusion of financial support now revealed itself as a hollow shell, collapsing the moment accountability entered. The floors were littered with evidence of indulgence and neglect, remnants of a lifestyle sustained entirely by money that was never earned. Trash piled high, surfaces untouched for weeks, and silence that carried the echo of chaos. As I moved through the house, the magnitude of what had been hidden from me began to surface. This was not just carelessness. It was a pattern of avoidance and exploitation. The walls bore witness to a life built on taking without giving, consuming without maintaining. Upstairs, in a room that should have offered rest, I stumbled upon something far more disturbing than the mess. Beneath the bed, concealed with deliberate effort, was a box sealed with tape, as if secrecy itself had weight. Opening it felt like crossing a line I could never return from. Inside were documents that made my hands tremble and my chest tighten. Letters from lenders, notices thick with threats, and contracts filled with numbers that didn't belong to them. As I scanned the pages, the truth struck with brutal clarity. My name stared back at me from the paperwork, printed cleanly at the top of a loan agreement I had never signed. The signature below it was a crude imitation, a forgery so brazen it felt like a personal assault. In that moment, betrayal became tangible. This was no longer about disrespect or entitlement. It was a calculated crime, committed by someone who had lived under my roof, eaten at my table, and smiled at me while stealing my identity. The realization burned through every excuse I had ever made for them. The negligence, the manipulation, the dependence, it all crystallized into something far more sinister. This was not desperation. It was premeditated betrayal. The house itself seemed complicit, its decaying state a reflection of the moral collapse inside the people who lived there. Every hidden corner felt like a lie I had chosen not to see. As I gathered evidence, the weight of the truth pressed down on me. This discovery stripped away the last remnants of denial. I had not just been used. I had been targeted. The trust I extended as family had been weaponized against me. The safety I believed I was providing had given them access, opportunity, and confidence to cross a line that could never be undone. Walking out of that house, I carried more than documents in my hands. I carried clarity. The truth hidden inside those walls was not just about fraud. It was about the cost of unchecked trust and the danger of confusing loyalty with blindness. Betrayal does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it hides beneath the floorboards of familiarity, waiting for the moment when support ends and reality can no longer be concealed. That house was no longer a home. It was evidence, and with it, the final proof that love without boundaries can become the gateway to destruction. Losing a sister is not something that happens in a single moment. It unfolds slowly, through choices, silences, and realizations that chip away at the bond, until one day you recognize it no longer exists. The day I truly lost her was not when we argued or when the police intervened, but when I understood that protecting her meant sacrificing the very people who depended on her most. Accepting that truth was the most painful decision of my life, yet it became the only path forward. I had spent years believing that loyalty required endurance, that love meant absorbing harm to keep the family intact. Walking away from my sister felt like betrayal, not just of her, but of the version of myself who once promised to always protect her. That promise haunted me as I watched the consequences of her choices spill over onto her children. They were too young to understand why meals were inconsistent, why their home felt unstable, or why the adults around them seemed more concerned with escape than care. In their confusion, I saw the cost of my silence. Choosing to intervene meant accepting that my relationship with my sister would never recover. There was no version of this story where I could both shield her from consequences and ensure the safety of her children. Saving them required standing firm while she unraveled. It required acknowledging that love cannot coexist with denial when lives are at stake. The moment I stepped into a protective role for those children, I stepped out of the role of sister she wanted me to be. The loss was heavy. I mourned not only the sister I had, but the sister I believed she could become. Letting go meant releasing years of shared history, memories shaped by loss and survival. It meant accepting that blood alone does not guarantee accountability or care. The grief came in waves, unexpected and sharp. Even as I watched the children begin to stabilize, two truths existed at once. I was grieving a relationship, and I was preventing further harm. The children became my compass. In their routines, their cautious trust, and their quiet resilience, I found purpose grounded in reality rather than obligation. They did not need grand gestures or endless spending. They needed consistency, safety, and adults who showed up sober, present, and prepared. Each small improvement in their well-being reinforced the painful certainty that this was the right choice. No matter how deeply it hurt, my sister's anger and accusations echoed in my mind long after the decision was made. I was called cruel, heartless, unforgiving, yet none of those words outweighed the image of two children finally sleeping peacefully, free from chaos they did not create. I learned that protecting innocence often requires confronting uncomfortable truths and allowing relationships built on dysfunction to fall apart. In losing my sister, I gained clarity. I learned that love does not mean unconditional tolerance of harm. It means recognizing when someone's choices place others in danger and having the courage to intervene. Saving those two lives came at a personal cost, one that will always ache in quiet moments. But I would make the same decision again. Some losses are necessary.